Well, good evening, everyone. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to Wolfson College, both those of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching through the live stream that we have on YouTube. We're delighted this evening to welcome to the Wolfson Earth Emergency Cluster Sir James Bevan. James and I have known each other too long to declare, but James was a British diplomat for many years. His first posting was in Kinshasa, and he's been posted to places like Washington and Paris and elsewhere. He had a year working as a fellow at Harvard, and then became the chief operating officer of the Foreign Office, and then finally ended his career in the Foreign Office as the High Commissioner to India. He then was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of the British Environment Agency. And it's in that capacity, where he has been working now for 5-6 years, that he's going to be talking to us tonight. James is going to talk for maybe only 10 or 15 minutes. So this is very much an opportunity for a conversation with him. And so those of you in the room, I'll be very happy to encourage questions, but also those of you online, you're very welcome to put in questions using the chat function, and we have Mariam who's going to pick up those questions and pass them on to us. So I hope we can have a very spontaneous and interesting conversation. And James, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. First of all, let me just tell you who I am. As Tim said, my name is James Bevan. I'm the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency. You might not know what we do. The clue is in the name. We basically protect and enhance the environment in this country. And we do that in manifold ways, including by regulating most of the businesses in this country that pollute or threaten to pollute our air or our soil or our water. We do it also by seeking to enhance nature, creating new habitats for wildlife. We also do it, and Tim took me on a tour of your lovely grounds half an hour ago, and I saw the River Cherwell, which floods. We also protect the environment through building and maintaining the flood defences of this country, and by warning and informing communities when flooding threatens, and there is more of that threat, which I'll say something about in a minute due to climate change. And when flooding does hit communities, then our people are the people who turn out to support those who need it. But if you want a short version of what the Environment Agency does, it's in our strapline, which is create a better place. And at the heart of doing that, of creating a better place, is what I want to talk to you here in the room and all of you online about this evening, which is the climate emergency. I will speak, as Tim said, for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I am really interested then in having the conversation with you that Tim referred to, because this is about the most important conversation that we can be having either in this room or in the world right now. But I wanted to start by saying a word of praise to all of you and to Wolfson College. I know about your first president, Sir Isaiah Berlin. I know about the new, untrammeled and unpyramided way that he wanted this institution to work, and I think it does work in that way, and that's a fantastic way to operate. I know that you have a very progressive ethos in this college, and that's shown in the way that you are responding to the climate emergency itself. I think you are aiming to be the first net zero higher education institution. I think you're a long way along that journey. It's a difficult journey. We can say a bit more about that because we're on that journey as well ourselves, if you'd like, in a minute. I know you've got the Earth Emergency Cluster here at Wolfson that contributes some of the massive expertise that you have to the broader global debate about the challenges that we face, and that's fantastic. And I know you have your own green team, the staff and the students on the ground who are the driving force behind those initiatives and many of the other ones that you're leading. And that's fantastic, and you deserve massive credit, and that's why I think Wolfson is the ideal place to discuss the climate emergency. Now, you hear quite a lot about the climate emergency these days. A lot of it's depressing. I'm not going to depress you tonight. Tonight I thought I'd try something different. What I'm going to do this evening is look into my crystal ball and give you two versions of the future, either of which are possible. The first one, which is the future that we might end up, is not just possible, but it's quite scary. And the second future, which we could also end up with, is the opposite of that. It's reassuring, it's inspiring, and it's uplifting. And it's entirely possible that we can realise that second future rather than the first. And the reason I say that is because we all have agency. We're not powerless in any of this. So tonight I'm going to tell you how we can beat the climate emergency by, to coin a phrase that has been much used over the last few years, by taking back control. Now, before I polish up my crystal ball, I'm going to give you a health warning about any futurology, which is that it's a lot harder than it looks. And I know this from my own personal experience because, as Tim has just told you, 17 years ago, when your president and I were both diplomats, the Foreign Office sent me to Harvard for a year to improve my mind. They didn't send Tim on the ground that his mind was already sufficiently improved, but they clearly thought that there was something about mind that needed it. And while I was there, which was 2005, I actually wrote a paper on the world in 2020, in which, based on what was then the best analysis and the best futurology and the best future studies, I tried to identify what the world would look like 15 or so years hence, in order to help the Foreign Office, which I was then working for, prepare for that world. And when you invited me to do this talk this evening, I went and looked out that paper, which I hadn't read for several years. And it turns out, a bit like the BBC weather forecast, that I got about 50% of the predictions right. One of the predictions that I got right was the, frankly, rather shamefully safe prediction that the world would remain unstable and unpredictable. I'm not particularly proud of getting that right. There's one prediction I did get right, which I'm a bit prouder of getting right, though I'm not at all happy that it came to pass, which is that I did recognise that by 2020 the world would have experienced at least one major pandemic. But among the many things that I got wrong was that I failed to identify what is the greatest threat that we would face in the decade in which we now live. I thought, and again, this is not an unreasonable assumption, but it turned out to be wrong. I thought that the future would turn out to be much like the past. And that's another safe assumption, and it's also one that turns out often to be wrong. And therefore, looking forward in 2005 to where we are almost now, I thought that the greatest threats to the world as a whole would remain terrorism and nuclear weapons, which is what they were, or were deemed to be, in 2005. And that was wrong. It was wrong because, as we all know now, and I think very few people would dispute today, the greatest of all threats is not either of those. The greatest of all threats that we face as a planet, as a society, as a civilization, is the climate emergency. So, I offer these thoughts with a degree of humility, entirely justified given my previous track record. I should also add, though, in defence of getting it wrong at least half the time in trying to look forward a few years ago, that it turns out that most other people who try to predict the future also don't do that well. And I'll just give you a few examples which at least made me feel a bit better. One is a famous memo written by Western Union, the US telegraph company, in 1876. And the memo reads, "This telephone has far too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication." Lord Kelvin, who many of you will know, was the distinguished scientist and president of the Royal Society. 1895, lecture, "Heavier than air flying machines are impossible." Hal Warner of Warner Brothers, famous US movie company, 1927, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" And Popular Mechanics, which is a US magazine, may still be going, I don't know, 1949, "Computers in the future may weigh no more than 1.5 tons. And my personal favourite is the Decca Record Company, which is a British record company, which is still, I think, just going. 1962, rejecting a little-known pop group from Liverpool, who said, Decca said, "We don't like their sound and guitar music is on the way out." And that pop group was, of course, the Beatles. So I'm telling you this just as a health warning. It isn't easy to predict the future, but I think it is important that we try. And it is even more important that we try and shape that future in the ways that we want. And there's always a choice. We do have agency. Now, I know that existential climate dread, people worrying about climate and the future, it's a thing now. I hear more and more accounts of effects on people's well-being, both mental and physical, from, if you like, worry about climate. And one of the main reasons, I think, that people, when they get stressed, one of the main reasons that people get stressed or that they worry is if we feel that we're powerless in the face of a threat. And there are actually some interesting academic studies that show that Air Force pilots experience lower stress levels than train commuters. And the reason for that is that although the pilot is in danger, she is also in control. But the commuter sitting on the train waiting for it to go, or standing on the platform waiting for the train, although they're not in danger, they're not in control. And that lack of control, that lack of agency is what contributes often to feelings of powerlessness and anxiety and dread. And the big fact that I want you to hear about the climate emergency is that actually we are in control of this. We can decide what happens to our planet. We can choose the future that we all want. So let me give you my two future scenarios. Doing nothing is a choice. We can choose if we want. That kind of future A, which would involve us carrying on, running our lives and our economies more or less, as we have done since the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's essentially based on energy which is derived from carbon. In which case, we'll continue to put out more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that will cause more and more global warming. And the effect of that is well known because it's already happening, and we in the Environment Agency are already seeing it happen. It will mean, if we choose that future, that sea levels will continue to rise as the glaciers and the polar ice caps melt. Since most of the world's population happen to live near or on the coast or in low-lying areas, that fact is an existential threat. It will mean, if we choose that future, more extreme weather, as the rising heat drives more intense storms, more violent rainfall, more extreme flooding, more extreme heat waves, killing droughts, killing wildfires. Now that series of events poses obvious direct threats to lives and livelihoods, but there are also a lot more subtle threats in that future. So there are threats to our food supply if it becomes harder to grow the things on which we all depend. There are threats to human health if we allow the climate to change radically, both in terms of the enhanced risk of disease, but also the additional stress that it will put on physical and mental well-being for our species. There will be subtle disturbances to ecosystems as plants and animals find that they can't cope with the more extreme weather. There will be damage to peace and stability as growing resource scarcity starts to drive a potential rise in conflict. And you can already make the argument that some of the conflicts that we've seen in the last decades or so, Darfur would be one, have at least in part been driven by climate. And there will be negative consequences for something that we all care about, and I know you care about in this college, which is justice and fairness and equity, because one of the many insidious things about the climate emergency is that the people who are least responsible for causing it are the ones who are going to suffer most when it happens. Now, those effects are all global, but the place we'll feel them, all of us, is locally. So I thought I'd illustrate a bit of what that future A might look like for where we are today, for Oxford. Now, Oxford, I know it reasonably well. You don't need me to tell you it's a lovely, lovely place. It was founded, as we all know, as a river crossing on the Thames, and that lovely string of braided watercourses which traverse the city. That's a wonderful feature of Oxford. It's a city that's got a lot of lovely, agreeable homes, a lot of them built on drained marshland. It's surrounded by beautiful countryside. It's got fantastic quality of life. It's got a really strong knowledge and services economy, and you're a big part of that knowledge economy. It's got some wonderful modern infrastructure, including, let's say, Wolfson. It's got easy road and rail connections to the rest of the country. And it's got an attractive combination of the traditional, so, punting, swimming in the Cherwell, and the modern. Example, Wolfson College. You don't need me to tell you either that Oxford is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, and it's got some of the world's most iconic ancient buildings. So all that's fantastic, and every single one of those things are at risk if we choose future A. Because in that version of the future, the city of Oxford is itself at risk, as we see more frequent and more violent flooding, making it less and less livable, including Wolfson, less and less tenable. We see in that future here those lovely homes and those important businesses increasingly at risk as it becomes harder and harder to keep the water out of places that are built on floodplain or drained marshland. And if you zoom forward to about 2100, about 80 years from now, and we're in future A, then the countryside around the city of Oxford and the abundant wildlife that it contains will be dying as extreme temperatures, drought, and climate-driven disease take hold. It gets worse. The quality of life will be dropping in Oxford because pollution will be making the air harder to breathe. It'll be making water scarcer and more expensive. And the weather won't be anymore, the subject of polite conversation at the bus stop. The weather will be something that we fear If you liked, maybe you do like angling, one of the many things the Environment Agency does is regulate angling. You can forget about that because in future A, by about 2100, the river temperatures will be so high that most fish just won't be able to survive. I mentioned the great infrastructure that you have here and the links that you have to other parts of the country. Those will be collapsing by 2100 in this version of the future because the stress of much higher and more variable temperatures and much more violent and much more voluminous rainfall will be really starting to eat away at infrastructure that wasn't designed for those stresses. And that will mean that, roads, rail, other infrastructure will be getting such a lot of damage that it may by then be virtually impossible to repair the damage quickly enough. I'll finish with the bad news in a minute, but just let me give you the rest of it. The cities, that economy that you've got, that vibrant mix of services and knowledge economy that you've got in this city, that will be in free fall in 2100 under this scenario because supply chain disruption will be damaging those economic assets and because it will just be a lot less attractive for people to come here and stay here and a lot harder for them to do those things. And even the very buildings of Oxford, which we all cherish, by 2100, under this scenario, they will be falling apart as a result of the kicking the more extreme weather will be giving them. And if I was lecturing to this audience in 2100, you would not believe, or at least the students and postgrads of 2100 would not believe in this scenario that anybody ever jumped off Magdalen Bridge into the Cherwell on May morning because all that will remain of that lovely river outside this college will be a puddle that won't break your fall, but will definitely break your ankles if you try jumping into it. So all that might sound like bad science fiction, but actually it isn't because all of those things can happen and they will happen, not just in Oxford, but all around the world, unless we do take action to make sure that they don't. And the good news is that we can. The bad news is that some of those things are already with us. So the hottest temperature in the United Kingdom ever recorded, 38.7 degrees, happened in 2019 in a place that I think has been your traditional rival for the best part of 1,000 years, Cambridge. The highest rainfall ever recorded in the United Kingdom fell in 2015 when a gauge at a place called Honister Pass in Cumbria recorded 341 millimetres of rain in 24 hours. That rain went on to cause some of the worst flooding in living memory. 2020 saw the wettest February on record in this country, with some areas getting a month's worth of rain in 24 hours, and some of them getting over 400% of their average monthly rainfall. And that caused the Met Office to have to introduce 2 new colours to their rainfall maps, just to show the new intensity of that rainfall. And it also caused, and this is where the Environment Agency was directly involved, some of the highest river levels that we've ever seen in this country. And on 16 February 2020, we in the Environment Agency had in place 600 flood warnings across the country, and that was the highest number that we have ever had to put out. So that's the bad news. The good news is that none of these extremes that I've outlined need to happen because we can take back control, we can build the future that we want. And we can do that in 2 very simple ways. We do it by tackling the cause of climate change, by putting less carbon into the atmosphere, so that we can reduce both the speed and the extent of climate change, and that's called mitigation. And we can do it by tackling the effects of climate change, by making our places, our infrastructure and our economy and our society resilient to its impact. And that's called adaptation. Now, we in the Environment Agency, we're playing a big part in both of these things. We're a major player on mitigation because we regulate downwards most of the greenhouse gases that are emitted in this country from industry, from farming. And we run something called the UK Emissions Trading Scheme, which caps and gradually reduces the greenhouse gas emissions that come from aviation, from steel, and from other heavy industries. We're also a major player on the other side of the coin, adaptation. We build flood defences, including in Oxford, that will better protect communities in the face of growing flood risk. We work with planners and developers, including in Oxford, to create places that will be more resilient to climate shocks. We manage drought risk, so we also work to restore and enhance nature, planting trees, creating new habitat for wildlife, restoring peat bogs, returning rivers to their natural courses after the Victorians engineered a lot of them into straight drains, opening up rivers so that fish can move about again, all of which is actually not just making this country a better place to live, but also helps tackle climate change, because trees that we plant, the peat bogs that we restore, of course, also help trap the carbon that is causing climate change. And like you here in Wolfson, we're trying to walk the walk ourselves. We've made a commitment to make the Environment Agency a net zero organisation by 2030. And if you want, we can talk about that, because it's easy to say, and it turns out to be very difficult to do. Let me just underline a couple of really important points about tackling climate change before I finish. The first point is, if we get this right, and I'm an optimist that we can get this right, we can not just make things a lot less bad than they would otherwise be, but we can make them a whole lot better than they are now. That's the real opportunity of the climate emergency, is to take it and invert it and build a better world. Because if we do the right things over the next few decades, then we can build better places for people and wildlife. We can unlock sustainable, ethical, inclusive economic growth, and we can create a fairer and a more just world. So first point, we can make things better than they are. It's not about just making them less bad. Second point, we all have agency. Every single one of us has power in this situation. We can take back control in our own daily lives. Food accounts for up to 30% of each of our individual carbon footprints. So try to eat local, seasonal food, try to eat a bit less meat, less dairy. Travel accounts for another third of the carbon that each of us as individuals put out into the world. So walk or cycle, many people do that here in Oxford. Take trains or buses rather than cars if you can. And if you really do need to drive, then use electric or hydrogen vehicles. Heating our homes is the other major source of each of our carbon footprints. And I know you've done a lot here at Wolfson to address that issue. So, keep the heating no more than 19 degrees centigrade. We don't need more than that. Get double glazing or triple glazing, I think you put in here. Insulate your homes. Britain's homes are fantastically badly insulated. Switch to a renewable energy tariff. Think about solar panels. There are lots of things that we can each do to take agency in our own lives. And finally, and people don't often think about this, but I'll say it to you anyway, if you want to make an even bigger difference to your own effect on the climate emergency, then there are three little words to guide each of us, which are have less stuff. Because the fact is that resource consumption, the things that we have, the things that we use, That is the other really big X factor in our individual carbon footprints. Because every single thing that we have, every single thing that you can see in this building, every single thing that we're wearing, every single thing that we own in our own homes, every single one of those things has a carbon footprint. Because every single thing we have has embedded emissions. It's got the carbon that was emitted when that thing was produced. It's got the carbon that was emitted when that thing was transported from wherever it was produced to wherever we are. And it's got the carbon that will be emitted when it's eventually disposed of. So there are a whole bunch of hidden carbon emissions simply in the fact that we have, all of us, have lots of stuff. So let's try and have a bit less stuff, have fewer things, let's use them for longer, let's share them as far as possible with others. And if we tackle the climate emergency in the right way, at all levels, global, national, local, individual, in our daily lives, then I do think we will succeed. And if we do, here's what it'll look like. So this is future B, if we get this right. So Oxford, 2100, future B, we have successfully addressed the climate emergency. This city will be an even better place than it is now. It will be at ease with itself and its rivers. The risk of flooding will still be there, but the threat that it poses to the people of Oxford, to the places of Oxford, to the economy of Oxford, that threat will have reduced. That's because, in part, some of the flood schemes that the Environment Agency designs and delivers will have further reduced those risks in the face of a rising climate threat. The countryside around this city won't be dead, it will be greener, it will be bluer than it is now, and it will have more healthy and more abundant wildlife in it than it does today. Quality of life in this city will be even higher than it is now, because the air will be cleaner, the water will be purer, and there will be better places for people to live and to work and to play. For the anglers, fish will be more, not less abundant in the Cherwell and other rivers around this city. And while the weather will, I think, it will be, even under this scenario, more exciting than it was, because the amount of carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere, whatever we do today, is going to cause some change to the climate. The weather of 2100 in this scenario will not be life-threatening, and the city's upgraded infrastructure will cope easily. The city's economy, in this scenario, it'll be even stronger than it is now, not least because the knowledge economy, which is your and Oxford's unique selling point, that will be drawing in more investment, more jobs, more talent, because the knowledge economy is itself part of the solution to a changing climate. Tourists and students will still be flocking to this city, but they will live in it and they will move around in it in ways that don't cause harm to the planet. And the glorious buildings, including this one, and all the fantastic old and modern architecture of Oxford that make it what it is, they will still stand and they will still inspire future generations. And while the Cherwell, in this scenario, will be a thriving watercourse, it will still be just as dumb to try jumping off Magdalen Bridge as it ever was. So let me conclude. I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist about climate because while humans through history have done a lot of very dumb things, as a species we have also shown consistently that we are able to think our way out of whatever scrapes we have got ourselves into. And I've become a good deal more optimistic in the last 5 years. That's because in that time I think we have seen a real shift in the way that all the key players think about climate. So ordinary people around the world, I saw this in India, ordinary people are now seeing the damaging effects of a changing climate on their own lives, and that is putting pressure on governments all around the world to take action, and we're seeing that pressure translate into commitments. We saw that at Glasgow at COP in November. And public pressure on those governments, of whatever nature those governments are, will carry on building on them to do the right things on climate. Meanwhile, I'm seeing businesses all around the world, whatever governments are doing, businesses are doing it anyway, because it's not smart business to invest in carbon. Carbon assets are increasingly becoming devalued and risk becoming stranded assets. So businesses are themselves moving out of carbon and into sustainable future business models. And meanwhile, as I've said, and I see this every day, ordinary citizens are doing it for themselves by taking back control of the climate emergency in their own daily lives. The final reason I'm an optimist is because of all of you and your colleagues in the world of academia, science and research. Because you and your colleagues, you are the people who are every day identifying new ways, even better ways to tackle the climate emergency and build better economies and better societies than we have now. So I think that's where I'll end. I think that's enough futurology. I prefer to go by what they say to each other in Silicon Valley, which is that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So let me close by inviting you all to invent the future together. Thank you.
So, great. So thank you very much indeed, very inspiring. We've probably got about 20 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to hand the microphone around for questions, just so that the people online can hear the questions themselves. So let's first of all go up here and then I'll come here.
Shall I take my mask off? Thank you very much, and I would like to buy into your optimistic view of the future, as I'm sure we all would. I'm a campaigner for clean rivers in this region, and we would like to know what the Environment Agency can do more to enforce regulations of Thames water in this areas. We know there's a lot of pollution, not only sewage pollution. 70% of our drinking water comes from rivers and reservoirs in the Thames region. And of course, it's full of pathogens, antibiotics, anti-epileptics drugs, which are going to have very long-term effects on our bodies. So when you mention the Environment Agency wants to create a better place, can we have assurance that there will be more regulation, more effective regulation in the future? And I know that money has been cut back to the Environment Agency by the government, but what can you do?
Okay, thank you. It's a great question, and I'm passionate about water too. I live quite near the Thames. I walk around in the countryside alongside chalk streams, and those are amazing resources that don't exist almost anywhere else, and I care about them. I have 3 daughters. I want them to be able to enjoy those chalk streams, and I want our rivers and our coastal waters to be better than they are, not worse. The thing about water, and the other reason you should care about water if you care about the environment, is it gets everywhere. It's a rather facile thing to say, but the thing about water is it gets everywhere. And what that means is that the single biggest X factor in how the environment, what happens to the environment is what's in our water and how much of it there is. So it's really, really important that we have clean and plentiful water. The long-term history of the state of our rivers is that the Industrial Revolution, which also launched, if you like, climate change, dealt the rivers in this country a really awful blow. And by around about the 1950s, many rivers in this country were biologically dead, including the Thames. There was nothing that could live in that water. The good news is that the combination of better regulation, which the Environment Agency has played a part in, and investment and better behaviour by water and sewage companies has turned that situation around. And in most rivers now in this country, we are seeing the return of otter, salmon, other wildlife, smaller animals and plants, which are indicators of rivers returning to a lot better health than they were. So we made progress, but over the last few years, that progress has flatlined, and in some cases, it's gone backwards. So you're absolutely right to raise the issue. What do we do about it? I think it's a bit like the climate emergency. I think everybody has a role to play in sorting out our water issue. So the Environment Agency has a role to play because, as you say, we regulate the water and sewage companies, and we need to do more, and we are seeking to do more to hold them to their legal duties, which are not to pollute rivers or bathing waters. And we have just launched a very large criminal investigation into whether water companies are breaching the law in that respect, and if they are, we will take appropriate action against them, up to and including pressing for very severe sentences. But the Environment Agency on its own can't fix the problem of our rivers. We need the water companies to behave properly, and we need farmers, who are the other source of pollution in rivers, the other main source, to farm in ways that don't damage our waters. So there's a role for the people who pollute our rivers to improve their act. I think there's a role for government, which I think the government is playing, in putting more pressure on the water companies to clean up their act. I work very closely with government ministers, and I have seen government ministers be very clear in public and in private of their expectations now of water and sewage companies. And then lastly, again, like the climate emergency, I think a lot is on all of us. So, what we put down the toilet makes a massive difference. Whether we leave the tap running when we're brushing our teeth makes a massive difference to the amount of water that we actually have in this country. So, short answer, the Environment Agency is committed to clean and plentiful water, and we will work to that end until we get there. Slightly longer answer, but all of us have a role to play in it.
Thank you for your talk. I'm worried. I've heard more or less the same speeches for 20 years, optimistic, ending on a high note. Mm-hmm. Institutions are failing all around us, around our ears, absolutely everywhere. Politicians have given up on regulation, don't see a future for them in enhancing and making it stricter. What about a pushback to how do you see institutions functioning in the future? How do you see a framework for regulation that will be accepted and used? And what about holding the most senior people to account? When it's a company, an ambiguous entity, you've got company directors who are signing this stuff off, they're getting massive salaries. Why are they not being held to account?
Yeah. So I as Tim said, I spent a few years in India. And one of the reasons that I'm a passionate believer in regulation is because when I was in India, I visited Bhopal. Now, many of you will know that in, I think, 1984, Bhopal, which is a beautiful city, was the site of the world's worst industrial accident when a factory right in the center of that city exploded and sprayed poisonous gas over a very large area. And I visited Bhopal, and I saw the site of the factory, which is still rusting away, and I looked at the water on the ground, which is still poisoned, and I met people who had either been there when that happened or were the descendants of people who had been there when that happened, and their lives have been completely ruined. And the scandal is that nobody has been held to account for that. And there were people who were responsible who should have been. So I'm a big believer in regulation. Regulation, the right kind of regulation is not red tape. It's what keeps people alive and enhances and protects our environment, so we have to have it. I think we do have to constantly make the case for it. It goes in and out of fashion. You have governments that want less and governments that want more. I don't think we want regulation that is over heavy. I think we want regulation that is risk-based and proportionate and can be delivered by the businesses that need to deliver it. But I do think we do need regulation. Now we have to keep making the argument to successive governments about why. And on your final point, I agree, and I'm on record as having said, and I'll say again tonight, that the penalties for severely damaging our environment should be far harsher than they currently are. The good news is that courts have increasingly increased fines. So last year, the Environment Agency took a prosecution against Southern Water, and we secured a record £90 million fine against Southern Water. But frankly, for very big companies, that's kind of small change. That's kind of an operating cost. The thing that would really concentrate the minds of any potential polluter is the knowledge that their chair or their chief executive will go to jail if they do not abide by the law. And we have said...
Expand on that bit, because that's the really important...
Yeah, so you know, it's not, I don't control, you know, the sentencing guidelines, but I do make the case, and will continue to make the case to the government, that sentences for severe pollution should be more severe and should target individuals who are responsible.
I'm interested that you spent time in Kinshasa. Listening to the World Service the other day, there's a rare monkey that, of which there's only 1,000 left in the world, and I believe that the government there is building a national park to save them. In the UK, we have only just over 1,000 hectares left of floodplain meadow, 4 square miles, which is the size of Heathrow Airport. Recent research from the Open University suggests that recreating floodplain meadows has a 25% success rate. So I'm just interested, the flood alleviation scheme in Oxford is going through actually a connected network of floodplain meadows, one of which should be a site of special scientific interest, but as we know, unlike listed buildings where every important building is listed, with landscape habitats, it's only an exemplary approach. And floodplain meadows are actually the most diverse botanical habitats in the UK. So in the context of where the flood alleviation scheme is only protecting those houses that flood from the Thames, not from groundwater rising or from runoff. How does one square that circle of destroying? In theory, a part of the meadow, but actually one knows very well, owning one of these floodplain meadows, that if you drive any vehicles across, you're effectively destroying the whole thing.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence to show that translocation that the Environment Agency is suggesting that they'll do has any success at all.
Okay.
And that's completely obvious.
Okay. So I've visited the scheme several times. When we build flood schemes, we always try to achieve multiple outcomes. And we try to avoid a bunch of negative outcomes, including some of the ones that you've rightly identified. So we will never build a flood scheme that will enhance anybody else's flood risk. The aim is to reduce everybody's flood risk. And we will always try, when we build a flood scheme, not just to be net neutral in what we do to nature, but to enhance nature rather than damage it. Now, it may be, there will be, in Oxford may well be a case, but there are other cases around the country where, although we'd rather not, the only way we can deliver the benefits of the flood scheme, including protecting people's lives and livelihoods and protecting some of the environment and the wildlife that goes with it, is to do some damage to some other bit of the environment. We've occasionally, for example, had to cut down bits of ancient woodland. Nobody wants to do that. When we do things like that, we'll only do those as a last resort, and we'll always seek to remediate so that we end up with more nature than we have had to damage. So, my commitment to you is, we care about the environment just as much as we care about, protecting people against flooding. That's one of the reasons why the Environment Agency was configured as it is. So we're not just focused laser-like on floods. We're equally focused on nature, and we'll always try to do the best we can, both for the people and the wildlife and the habitats.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? We've got one here, but, we've got one online. Let's just do one online and then I'll come there. Oh, right. Please do.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very interesting. I just wanted to know how do national borders are placed when you talk about environmental crisis globally in the Environmental Agency? Because I imagine it's a universal problem, and some countries, especially in the global south, are really focused on poverty and inequality, and they do not have the infrastructure to implement mitigation and adaptation practices. And so how do you address that? I mean, it's nice to just talk about how we can make Oxford a better place or UK a better place while we ship our factories or waste to other countries. And so I just wonder, like, how do national borders really kind of feature in this kind of
that's a really good question. So you're absolutely right. You know, the effects of climate change are local, but the solutions have to be global because, you know, it's a global issue. We do work with other countries. We work, for example, with the Dutch and with the Japanese on managing flood risk and tsunami risk. And we learn as much from our international partners as I hope they learn from us. We are looking at what more we could do with developing countries, and my own hinterland in India and other parts of the developing world, like Africa, makes me particularly keen that we should do that. And again, I actually think that it's not a one-way street. So in India, you know, there was a massive amount of astonishing innovation that was delivering solutions for India's energy issues that were good for the climate, and we can learn a lot from those developing countries too. And I guess the final thing I'd say is I think the reason that it's important that we work across those international borders is not just because we'll be better at tackling the climate emergency, though we will. It's because it's about justice. You know, the people in this country who will be hardest hit by the climate emergency are the poorest and least advantaged communities. You think about Africa, or you know, the fishermen of the Sundarbans in India. You know, you can just go all around the world in the developing world, and they'll be hit 100 or 1,000 times harder. So if you care, you know, if you don't care about climate, fine, although you should, but you should care about justice, and that's the reason why we need to tackle this.
I'll come over here and then up. Can I just check? You don't do Northern Ireland, do you?
We do some things with Northern Ireland, but we are basically a UK or a British and English organisation.
Thank you. It's recorded that your enforcement budget's been cut from 400 million to 40 million. And in Oxford, just at Cassington sewage plants, pumping raw sewage through into the Thames on a regular basis, affecting an SAC, and it seems to be constant. So just how do you go to government to get more enforcement, and what, if you only got 40 million, obviously that's cutting your enforcement, but surely increased enforcement is going to help sort the problem out, and it's happening all over the country. So I just wonder what your feelings were about enforcement.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. You know, regulation, good regulation requires both a carrot and a stick, right? You want to encourage people to abide by the rules, but if they don't, you need a big stick to force them. And you're right that over the last decade or more, the amount of money available for the Environment Agency to do that enforcement, to monitor, to require people to abide by the regulations and to take people to court, the money that we've had available for that has reduced. That's true across the public sector as a whole. The whole of the public sector is having to try and do more with less, and I don't think that's a challenge that we should sort of shy away from, because you know, every good organisation ought to aspire to do that. How do we resolve the conundrum? Well, firstly, we do have good conversations with the government. I spent quite a lot of the last few months, as you can imagine, having conversations with the government precisely about this issue. And though I can't give you any figures tonight, we've had some quite reassuring signals from the government about their readiness to put more money into tackling, in particular, the issues of pollution of rivers than has been, and that's welcome. I think the other way that how do you do better with less? Answer, you do it together, which is why, my answer to you, Madam, about how we improve our rivers. We need to harness, the technical abilities of an organisation like the Environment Agency to monitor and regulate, and the legal powers that we have, and use those to the full, to the fantastic energy and understanding of, volunteers, NGOs, other people around the country, who also know, as you may know far better than I, what's going on in your local river. And so one of the other things we're doing is looking at how we can set up, if you like, a kind of national monitoring system where everybody can report to us what's going on in rivers, and that'll enable us both to better see what's going on and to take the right targeted action to get the right outcomes.
I think we've got time for one more, and I'm going to come to Paolo, who's the head of our green team, who I think had a question.
Thank you very much. My question is about achieving future scenario B that you described. And you mentioned that one of the reasons you're optimistic is that because of communities like this that develop knowledge. How reliant are we in developing new knowledge to achieve scenario B as opposed to relying in better business models and better economic policies to use the current knowledge, the technologies that already work, to achieve this future scenario B?
Can you just say that? I didn't get the last bit. Just say, yeah.
Maybe without the mask, yeah. How reliant are we in new knowledge to achieve scenario B versus using current knowledge, current technology?
Okay, fine. That's a really, really good point. So tackling the climate emergency is not rocket science, right? We know what's happening, we know why it's happening, and know what the answer is. We have to reduce output of greenhouse gas emissions so that we slow and hopefully stop the change in the climate. And we have to build a society and an economy that is more resilient to the effects of a changing climate, which is going to happen anyway. So the solutions are actually quite simple. And we already have a lot of the technology that we need to do that. Example, hydrogen vehicles, which currently are fairly rare, but in 10 or 15 years, maybe the sort of standard vehicle that are used to get around if people need to get around. And we are increasingly, not just as a country but as a world, moving into the world of getting our energy from sustainable sources, from renewables, rather than burning carbon, right? So we've already got we already know what we have to do. We've already got much of the technology that we need to do it. But we can always be better. We can always have cheaper technology because there are costs involved. We can always have more effective technology because it can always be more effective. What I think we should refuse, and I had this debate with Indian friends, is there are people who sometimes like to say it's too expensive, right? We can't afford scenario B, right? Because we need jobs and growth and housing now. And that's a false choice, right? If you ask people to choose between, on the one hand, jobs and growth and prosperity and housing, and on the other, saving the planet, a lot of people are going to say, we'll have this and we can worry about that later. So, that's a false choice. We don't need to make that choice, because if we have the right policies and the right innovation, of which you're all part, we can have both of those things. And it's simply wrong to say that we cannot afford to tackle the climate emergency. It's actually the other way around. We cannot afford not to tackle it, because the cost of not tackling it will far outweigh the cost of tackling it. And part of my point about scenario B and you as at the heart of a knowledge economy is that putting the investment in to new ways of thinking, new technology, new innovation that helps us tackle the climate emergency is itself one of the best ways to drive the jobs and growth and ethical lifestyles that we want to have. So if anybody tells you we have to choose, say no. And if anybody tells you that it's too expensive, say it's not.
I think we've come to the end of our time. So may I just end with warm thanks to James for your presentation and taking the questions. I mean, I'm struck by how conversations like this, they can sometimes be repetitive. We do face the same issues again and again. They're extremely global and they're extremely local at the same time. And sometimes politically, it's quite difficult to get your head around issues around how do I live my life here in the rivers of Oxford with what happens in the Maldives. And yet these two are completely connected. And I guess that's moving from scale to scale and recognizing that they are connected. That, for me, gives you a sense of possibility and agency, that we're not simply in the hands of bigger global forces. We are in the hands, at least partly, of ourselves. And I hope that what we're trying to do at Wolfson aims to address that. But it also seems to me very important that we continue to ask questions, to challenge, to keep people accountable, to avoid greenwashing. Where we see greenwashing, call it out. And if we don't understand something, challenge people to do it. So, James, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And I hope you'll come to another of the Earth Emergency Cluster events in the college we have in the future. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.